Good evening and welcome. I'm Demetrius Udell, the Vice President of Academic Affairs here at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our historic Great Hall. The Cooper Union is a premier institution for students pursuing degrees in art, architecture, and engineering, and since its founding in 1859, has been guided by a commitment to advancing fair access to education for all, especially with regard to the ability to pay for a top-notch education. And this stage itself has been an integral and essential part of our educational mission from the beginning. Through 165 years of social movements and change, many of the world's most courageous voices and inventive minds have sought out the Great Hall as a public forum, a place to debate important issues of the day, to amplify calls for justice, to share learnings and new works, and to inspire New York audiences. Generations of political leaders, civil rights activists, advocates, artists, and intellectual luminaries have addressed audience from this very lectern. I would invite you to learn more about the Great Hall's most memorable moments by visiting the Voices from the Great Hall digital platform. There is a QR code in your program that will take you directly there. This new digital archive encompasses all known sound and video recordings, as well as flyers, posters, and other ephemera from Great Hall programs held by the Cooper Union dating back to 1859. Evenings like tonight are only possible because of the dedication and creativity of our staff. Many thanks to all of you. And I also want to acknowledge the Robert David Lyon Gardiner Foundation for their generous support of both the Voices of the Great Hall archive and our Great Hall programming, which is nearly always free to the public as it is tonight. So if you enjoy yourself this evening, as I know you will, please check our ongoing lineup of events and come back again and often. Tonight, we gather in this historic place for another important debate. Our esteemed panelists will discuss the issue of the rising number of attempts to remove certain books from school and public libraries, and they will explore what this means for issues of censorship, education, power, and identity, as well as our personal freedoms and the freedoms for American families today. The often quoted, and according to some misunderstood, statement of W.H. Auden that poetry makes nothing happen refers us to the implications of tonight's discussion. Despite the contemporary mantra about the ongoing decline and irrelevance of the humanities, this dispute reminds us that words do things, something which Auden knew very well. Indeed, as the intellectual historian J.G.A. Pocock noted, language is never neutral, for it invokes values, it summarizes information, it suppresses the inconvenient. Otherwise formulated, words order our consciousness and shape our social worlds. For this reason, it becomes important, especially in this highly charged moment, that we are intentional about what we mean, because we are actually discussing the kind of world in which we want to live, and more profoundly, how we may coexist in it. Censorship has been a recurring theme in the debates in the Great Hall for decades. In 1950, during a public program event called Censorship in Libraries, David K. Bernninghausen, head librarian of our own Cooper Union, stood on the stage declaring, "All books should be made available, and no book shall be removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. Libraries must challenge all attempts at censorship to resist all abridgment to free access to ideas and full information, full freedom of expression that are the tradition and heritage of Americans." 75 years on, the debate is far from settled. Bernninghausen's sentiments are echoed by organizations like the American Library Association and PEN America, which gather national data on book bans and challenges and decry the rising number of efforts to remove book titles, especially those targeting LGBTQI and race-themed books as attacks on our freedom to read. But across the country, there are a growing number of parents, lawmakers, and activists who feel, with similar passion, that they are also upholding the tradition and heritage of America by using their voices and votes to advocate for the review and removal of literature that they feel is either inappropriate for children or deemed as damaging to society. They share their concerns at what they see as the rising number of titles that include sexually explicit or derogatory content. For those caught in the middle, the librarians and teachers who have lost their jobs, the school and public libraries at risk of losing funding, and the authors and creators whose freedom of expression is threatened, it is a very difficult road. Ultimately, what does all this mean for freedom of inquiry and expression in American society today? And where, if any place, might common ground be found? So to help us unpack these issues and answer these questions, we have assembled a truly august panel of speakers tonight. Emily Drabinski is Associate Professor at the Queens College Graduate School of Library and Information Studies. She publishes and presents widely on topics related to knowledge organization, information literacy, and critical perspectives in librarianship. Emily edits Gender and Sexuality in Information Studies, a book series from Library Juice Press. She's also a contributing editor at Truth Out. She currently serves as president of the American Library Association. Rahna Epting is the executive director of MoveOn and MoveOn Political Action, the largest member-led political campaigning organization with nearly 10 million members. For tonight's panel, Rahna will be participating in her role as executive director of MoveOn and not the Political Action Committee. MoveOn mobilizes the left to win elections and enact progressive change. Before taking on this role, she served as MoveOn's 2018 elections program director. Previously, she served as Every Voice's chief of staff, where she managed state and national campaigns to make democracy work for all. She also led the Service Employees International Union's political program for members, engaging the powerhouse union's membership to run for office, fight for passage of the ACA, and lobby their elected officials to advance change. She's also a frequent commentator on progressive politics and policy, appearing on broadcast and cable outlets like MSNBC, NBC, CNBC, and in other outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, AP, and USA Today. Also here tonight, we are delighted to welcome Roxane Gay back to the Great Hall. A frequent Great Hall speaker, she's an author and cultural critic. Her work has garnered international acclaim for its reflective, no-holds-barred exploration of feminism and social criticism. With a deft eye on modern culture, she brilliantly critiques its ebb and flow with both wit and ferocity. Her collection of essays, Bad Feminist, is considered the quintessential exploration of modern feminism. NPR named it one of the best books of the year, and Salon declared the book trailblazing. Roxane was the first Black woman to lead a Marvel title, writing a comic series in the Black Panther universe, World of Wakanda. She hosts the Webby award-winning podcast, The Roxane Gay Agenda, where she has interesting conversations with interesting people. She also pens the Work Friend advice column for the New York Times. Robert Pondiscio is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, teaching, school choice, and charter schooling. Before joining AEI, Robert was a policy analyst and education reform expert at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, an education policy think tank. He became interested in education policy issues when he started teaching 5th grade at South Bronx School in 2002. Before that, he worked in journalism for 20 years, including in senior positions at Time and Business Week. Robert is the author of many books exploring issues in education and has been extensively published in publications such as The Atlantic, Education Next, the New York Daily News, and the Wall Street Journal. And finally, to moderate our distinguished panel tonight, we also welcome back Wesley Morris to the Great Hall. Wesley is a critic at large at the New York Times and a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine, where he writes about popular culture and hosts the podcast Still Processing with Jay Wortham. For 3 years, he was a staff writer at Grantland, where he wrote about movies, television, and the role of style in professional sports, and co-hosted the podcast Do You Like Prince Movies? Before that, he spent 11 years as a film critic at the Boston Globe, where he won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for criticism. In 2021, he was awarded a second Pulitzer in criticism for his writing at the Times. He's from Philadelphia, lives in Brooklyn, and is a graduate of the 1997 class at Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Emily, Rahna, Roxane, Robert, and Wesley.
Thanks for coming. I'm going to sit on the edge of my seat, not as a
Right, I never know.
preview. Don't do that.
No, do that, okay.
I learned, somebody very important told me never to be in public slouching. You'll just regret it for the rest of your life. So I have obeyed.
How's this? Yes.
That's great. Fantastic. Thanks for doing this. Thank you guys for coming. I figured a good place for us to start would be basically to define what it basically is we're here to talk about, essentially. And I feel like a good way to do that is to think about this at first from the standpoint of terminology, data, and research. And I feel like that, in some cases, in almost every case, means starting with you, Emily. So the organization you lead, the American Library Association, collects and reports data on the instances of what the ALA calls book bans and challenges, right? Excuse me. So first, basically, can you tell us what data you're collecting, and then what story, or a story, what is a story that the data actually tells?
Sure, so the ALA, the American Library Association, collects data on books that are challenged or attempts to censor books in public school, academic libraries, and we have an Office of Intellectual Freedom that has been tracking those numbers for the past 20 years. People call in and report, we will scan the news and see what is being challenged, and those numbers, as we've seen the last 3 years, have just been going up and up and up. So in the first 8 months of 2023, we saw 695 attempts to ban or censor books in libraries, covering more than 3,600 individual titles. 1,900 of those were included in mass attempts to ban books. So what we're seeing that's really different is that it used to be that like a person would come and they'd have a question about a book. And like we should demand more of our public institutions, and that's totally appropriate. And so libraries, they have challenge policies. You'll come and say, hey, this book doesn't seem quite right. And then it would go through a challenge process, and sometimes the book would be reshelved or removed or anything like that. But now what we're seeing are mass numbers of books at a time, in some cases up to 500 individual titles. We were talking backstage about a librarian in northern Idaho in Boundary County who faced a challenge in her community to 500 individual titles, the vast majority of which are written by or about Black experience or the experience of people of color or LGBTQ plus experience, 500 individual titles challenged at one go. How many of those books do you think she had in her collection?
Oh, I know the answer, but that's because you told me.
Zero, yeah. A goose egg, right? So what we're seeing are challenges that have nothing to do with what is actually going on in American libraries in huge numbers. And what we're not recording is all of the times when librarians think, this is not a book I can put on the shelf. I don't have the wherewithal to battle that because of staffing problems and systematic underfunding of the institution. So It doesn't count the kind of silent censorship that I think if we could capture those numbers of people too afraid to buy books or too concerned to put up on the shelves, that number would be even higher.
So I want to ask you all about your feelings on what it is we're talking about. I mean, some of this is about language, being the language we're using to talk about this problem. And so I guess, what do people mean when they say banned is a question I like to ask everybody. And what should they mean when they use that term? And are there better terms to describe what it is that is happening at these institutions? Robert, I'll start with you.
Sure. Look, there's no such thing as a book ban, right? Not in a country with First Amendment protections. You can walk into a bar. You do walk into a Barnes and Noble. The first thing you see right on the floor: ban books. Well, if the books were banned, you wouldn't be able to sell them. You'd go to jail for selling or possessing them. Over the weekend, by the way, I thought it would be kind of fun to come up with a list of things that really are banned. So I started Googling, where can I buy a hand grenade? And is it legal to own uranium-235? Then it occurred to me, this is how you end up in an FBI watch list. So I stopped doing that. Look, I bring a lot of different, or I wear a lot of different hats for this conversation. I'm a certified elementary school teacher. I'm the president of my local library board in upstate New York. I'm an author who sometimes rubs people the wrong way with the things that I write. And my day job is an education policy analyst. So my answer to the question of terminology depends, well, which of those hats do you want me to wear? Because in any case, I think the language of book bans and censorship is imprecise and maybe intentionally provocative. When I wear my author, journalist, library board president hat, I'm a free speech zealot. As a teacher, particularly of young children, I'm an elementary school teacher.
How long did you teach?
5 years in the South Bronx and several years after that part-time at a charter school in Harlem. So then I apply a very different set of screens and terminology. You're talking about the decisions that educators make on behalf of children, not their own. So even then, you have to dice more precisely. First, there's curriculum. Those are the books that we assign, we require kids to read. Very small number of books. We never talk about classroom libraries. Most every teacher in America has hundreds, if not thousands, of books in their library, most of which they have never read themselves. Then there's the one that everybody talks about, the school library. We're still talking about a very, very small slice of the number of books available. And then it's what we're arguing about tonight are a vanishingly small number of books that get challenged. And what we're going to disagree about, I assume, is should every book be appropriate for a school library, for children? Probably not. I don't think that saying so makes one a censor. I think, frankly, it makes one an adult.
Rahna?
Very provocative. I think we can get down to terminology and specific gradients of quote-unquote banning, but at the very essence, what we're talking about is restrictions and lack of access or restricted access to stories and books and perspectives, and a phenomena of I would argue, a wave of attempts across the country, concerted attempts across the country to restrict access, to impose one's idea of what is appropriate or not appropriate on an entire body of other people. And while I don't necessarily disagree with Robert's specifics around how we can break it down, I think it's respectfully somewhat silly to say we're not dealing with a book ban phenomena across the country. I think everyone has read about it. They've experienced it in their own local communities, at their own local school districts. And there is something quite real that's happening here that is fundamentally different than what we've experienced, or at least in my lifetime of the 45 years I've been on this planet.
Roxane?
I think that in some ways, yes, the number of books we're talking about is very small, but it's not about the quantity, it's the quality. It's the subject matters that are being censored in many states, in many school curricula, and in many libraries across the country. And it can be very arbitrary. All of my books are banned in one state or another, but the two that most recently have been banned the most are also the two I would never have imagined would be banned. And so then you have to start to ask, what are they trying to prevent? And in many cases, these are bans not only of books, but of ideas. It's a way of a small number of individuals to try and control what the members of that community know about. And these are things, especially when it comes to children, that should be handled not on a community level, but on a parent level. These are family decisions, and I don't object to any parent saying, you know, I don't want my kid to read this one book. That's fine. But to say that no child in a school district, for example, or in a county should be able to read a book is when we start to have to say, this is wrong, this is actually book banning, and it's a problem.
I'm curious what your experience has been like as an author whose books have been banned. I mean, it's funny, you say you're surprised about the two that have been singled out. One of them is Not That Bad, which is you thinking about rape culture in the U.S., and then the other one's your graphic novel. And so why do you think those have been singled out? And what do you, I don't know, what are the consequences of choosing that work?
Well, I think Not That Bad is probably banned because it talks about sexual violence. It's an
Sure.
anthology with, I think, 30 contributors. And people writing about different experiences with sexual assault or knowing people who've been assaulted. And I would not guess that that's controversial, but apparently it is.
Was it on curricula? Or was it
is
in the
on
library?
curricula,
Okay.
and it's both.
Okay.
It's taught in some school districts, and I don't actually think the whole book is taught. I think a lot of teachers are teaching specific essays, and it is also available in libraries. And with Sacrifice of Darkness, my graphic novel, I have spent hours trying to figure it out because it's a fantasy story about a man who flies an air machine into the sun and the world becomes shrouded in darkness. And then there's a happy ending. And it's really mild and innocuous. It's actually the nicest, sweetest thing I've ever written in my life. I mean, and so I'm just like, what exactly are you banning? It's
don't
weird.
you think they're
so,
banning
you know,
you?
it's a thing.
Don't you think they're banning you at some level?
Well, yeah, definitely.
I mean, that is really what it's about.
Definitely. And I have found that in some school districts and library districts, they're actually banning me because they don't know that my last name is my last name. They think it's something else. I mean, also, yes.
But not only.
Correct. I contain multitudes.
Well, I'm curious to just go back to the information Emily gave us at the top, which is basically that there's a sustained rise in these challenges. And I mean, well, actually, I want to, before I go into that, I do want to sort of get a little more clarity about this question of the use of the term ban. Is it, I mean, I'm thinking about whether that's the right term only because I don't know. And should we be thinking about this maybe with different words like restricted or reshelved or, you know, I mean, in Roxane's case, I'd say relegated or in some way. Is banned a great word to use to describe what is happening, or are there gradations that require other words?
When I hear Robert say that it's not banned because you could go to the Barnes & Noble and get it, that, like, yes, I can. But as anyone who has worked in an American public library will tell you, there are large swaths of the population who don't have the money to buy a book, who don't have a computer to check in on Amazon, who don't have broadband internet, who don't even have credit cards, right? And so the book is not banned for me, right? But it is banned for huge parts of the world that I think we conveniently forget about when we make this a conversation about the First Amendment. This is a conversation about access. Who has access to reading, who has access to ideas, who gets to both explore themselves as a reader and see inside of other worlds as a reader, and the library is the only place where you can do that. Now, if we live in a robust democracy, one of the things that comes with that, I think, is well-funded, fully staffed public institutions that serve the public good. So what we're seeing are attacks on books, but those are attacks also on both the idea of the public good, that it is something worth protecting, that it is something worth having. And I can tell you from touring the country and talking to hundreds of librarians that these attacks, these assaults don't stop with the book, They very quickly come after the institution itself. And these are institutions that have been systematically weakened by decades of disinvestment, and you end up with just sort of one librarian trying to hold the very last institution that exists in most communities that has the good of everyone in mind. And so that, I think, is what we're talking about. We're talking about access to a full and flourishing human life, more than just bare life. And so, yeah, you could buy the book on Amazon, but we have to expand the conversation, I think.
Okay. I guess procedurally now, I'm wondering who is deciding. I'm going to just be a naive person and asking this question the way I'm going to ask it. Who's deciding to ban which books? Like, who, from an organization standpoint, from an individual person who has access to a person in a position of power? I mean, to what extent are these grassroots campaigns in these municipalities and towns, and to what extent is it the opposite and these are top-down decisions? So I'm curious about what the procedure is to decide to challenge the books. And then I'm wondering, who then is making these decisions, writ large for what other people get to read in public institutions. And I'll start with you, Robert.
Sure, it's a great question, and the details matter. We're seeing a rise in book challenges because democracy, right? There have been a number of studies. Emily, you just referred to one of them, I think, from the very conservative Heritage Foundation to the very liberal Washington Post. And they more or less come to the same conclusion. Yes, book challenges are up, and I'm going to speak mostly about schools because that's the area that I know best. So school library challenges are absolutely up, fine. But when books are challenged, something happens. They get removed, they get reviewed. Most schools have review policies, and then more often than not, I think in like 80% of the cases, they get reshelved. Sometimes with some restrictions on age, on parental notification or permission, etc. Look, if this is not the way to adjudicate these disputes, then you need to tell me what is. A few miles from here, I'm sure you saw in the New York Times over the weekend, the Museum of Natural History shut down 2 entire wings, including exhibits that I used to take my 5th graders to see every fall before the New York State social studies test. You can't go see the Native American exhibits anymore because of federal regulations, okay? This is not mom and dad. This is a response to federal censorship. Forgive me, but I mean, if there's an example of censorship here, that's it. Restricting access to a museum to respond to a federal regulation. So if you give me the choice between, how do I want this to work? Mom and dad raise an objection, and then the school, one of 14,000 school districts, does what it does, and most times it ends up being reshelved.
But that's completely disingenuous. Because that is exactly what I started with, right? Like, we want that, and libraries have policies for that.
Right.
So.
This is what Roxane is sort of
But
saying.
that is not what we're facing right now. These are not mom and dad. These are, in many cases, people who don't even have a child in the school district at all, coming with a list of 300 books that they got from an extremist organization. It's not a good faith project.
Correct. And there should be good faith procedures, and you actually outlined them quite eloquently in your opening remarks. A lot of times these are, to answer your question, grassroots efforts by organizations that are well-funded, so it's not really grassroots. Right. But Moms for Liberty is behind quite a lot of these bans. And that's not just mom and dad sitting around the kitchen table worrying about what their children are reading. That's a bunch of swingers who have really really interesting sex lives trying to impose moral purity on everyone but themselves. So we can't pretend that all of these book challenges are happening in the same way. And the increase that we have seen over the past 2 years specifically is a concerted conservative movement. It's not just mom and dad or concerned community members. It's people who are well-funded and well-organized and have a very crystal clear agenda. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that and talk about it.
I think Roxane makes incredible points, and I would just add, when you ask, like, what's behind this? Yes, it's some organized grassroots work underneath it, but also the vast majority of bans across this country have been the result of a small handful of people challenging these books in these areas. And then the other thing, it's not just the act of challenging a book itself and then it resulting it being banned or reshelved or whatever word you want to put on it. It's this culture, it's creating an atmosphere of fear, or of intimidation for public servants, school librarians, public school teachers, school boards, what have you, people that do this work for the altruistic reason that they believe in public education, they believe in people having access to ideas and stories, and they're not used to being protested. They're not used to having this public attention, and they're all of a sudden, in the course of the last 2 to 3 years, are put in these situations where they now have to figure out how to navigate public pressure that never once was there, and how do I make a decision? And I presume, Emily might know better, that our processes across this country for challenging books are very antiquated, and they're not robust. And so people are finding themselves kind of hanging out on a limb, having to make these decisions under a culture of intimidation. And so that adds to what's banned, and kind of goes to what you were saying earlier, and how many books are not on the shelves because the person there is just afraid to put it there or put themselves in that spotlight.
I was talking to a librarian last week. They live in, I think it was Mississippi, and it wasn't just a book challenge, but people had taken out a billboard with his face on it, the library director, and we're like, he should not be the library. And that's intense, that kind of public harassment. It's not nothing. It's a kind of terror campaign.
And I would add, in my non-political capacity as much as possible, that there are politicians out there that have constructed a narrative that feeds this culture of banning books, that are proliferating messages saying it's not okay to be different. It's not okay to have a story that is not perfect, that it's not okay to be trans, to be gay, to be black, to be a descendant of slavery. And that's not the actual history of this country, and we don't want our children learning. So it's not just one entity or one organized effort or a set of individuals. It's an entire it's multiple layers that are building on itself that are creating this phenomena that we're seeing across the country.
Forgive me, you're the moderator. No, I'm not hearing an answer to the issue that I raised, which is, if not the process that we have, then what?
I have an idea. I mean, I am not an expert on book banning, but I'm an expert on hearing stories of folks all across this country when we took our banned bookmobile across the country. And, we met with Pennsylvania Representative Chris Robb, and he introduced a bill in Pennsylvania that actually is a great start. If you're going to challenge a book, you must have read it, first of all. Clap for him, not for me. You must have read it. There must be a public hearing. The decision cannot be made in the darkness. There must be public hearing. And there must be someone at the present at the hearing that has taught on the book, on the topic at hand. That seems like a good process to me. And I would argue that, part of the problem is that I bet you across the country there are different processes, and they're probably pretty administrative and not really robust enough for this country to have a real, thoughtful process in how we handle this.
I was just wondering what's behind this, right? I mean, because I feel like, and Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like, and Roxane, I mean, you've gone through it, so you can also correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there was a moment on the other side of, if not during the pandemic, where this became sort of more pronounced as a cultural problem. And it seemed, for whatever reason, and I think maybe children being at home, and then I don't actually know. I haven't thought through the turning point. But it seems to me that like the nature of these conversations and the books being banned are so culturally diverse, but also pointing in the same sort of moral direction. That I'm wondering how you guys identify what you think is driving what has been happening the last 4 years.
Well, I would say that we're seeing a cultural retrenchment, and it's been happening for several years. I don't know if the pandemic was the catalyst, but a lot of the progress that has been made over the past, I would say, 12 years, there are groups of people who are deeply invested in either stopping that progress or rolling it back, whether it's overturning Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision, or Donald Trump existing, or potential attacks on marriage equality. There are a lot of sort of cultural identity-based fronts, and I think when we talk about book banning, it's important to, yes, concern ourselves with the numbers, but more importantly, what are the topics that are being banned? Because Mouse, for example, is being banned, and that's a graphic novel.
Art Spiegelman's great graphic novel.
About the Holocaust.
Yes.
And really, yes, the Holocaust is unpleasant because it was a horrifying thing that happened, and millions of people, millions of Jewish people specifically, were slaughtered. So I can understand why parents would be concerned about how their children are learning about this, but the idea that their children shouldn't learn about it at all is a problem. And you could apply that to books about gay people, books about trans people. And many of these books do address these issues in age-appropriate ways. And so why are so many books about social issues, for lack of a better phrase, being banned? Why are people afraid of their children being even mildly discomforted by something that actually happened? Racism, for example, is a real thing. And there are many districts and counties that are suggesting that we should ban books about Black experiences. Why is Ta-Nehisi Coates' book being banned when it's really a letter to his son that is grappling with what it means to be a Black man in America? When people are uncomfortable with those kinds of things and they take that discomfort to mean that they should avoid it at all costs, we have to address that as much as we have to address the fact that these bans exist at all.
If I may, the answer to your question, what changed from the perspective of an educator, is glaringly obvious. COVID happened. So the work that I do, I study curriculum and instruction and whatnot, and it's a bit frustrating because the classroom is a bit of a black box. Well, suddenly for COVID, it wasn't a black box anymore. It was broadcast onto millions of homes, and it came into your home on the laptop on your kitchen table every morning. So now mom and dad could see what their kids were doing in school every day. There was no mystery. You weren't going through your kid's backpack like an archaeological dig. And in the main, obviously, most teachers acquitted themselves quite well. But for some number, it was jarring, whether because of low rigor, because of themes and discussions that happened in class. So I don't think there's any mystery as to what happened. That's what happened. COVID opened a window into the American K-12 system.
But why did that make us all assume that we know better than teachers and librarians? That's the part that really confuses me. Like librarians build collections for communities, and they build collections for everybody in the community. So if I was building a collection for my own personal library, it would have no science fiction in it because it's too long and boring, right? Like, no Dune. Dune is banned, right? But
I
as
want
a
to go to your
librarian,
library. It sounds
right?
hot.
But as a librarian, what you're doing is you're thinking expansively about everybody and making sure there's a book for everybody in the collection. And so I think what's jarring to me is the idea that someone who has no training, who does not work this job, who isn't involved in the profession, who doesn't have the background or training, who doesn't use our professional review tools, isn't part of the community that comes up with decisions about how we're going to build library collections, then wants to come in and say, that's not how we build library collections. Like, I cut my hair during the pandemic. I cut it myself, and guess what? A mistake. People, like, there are trained professionals who know how to do that.
I did not
like
realize
the
how funny you
undermining
were.
of our professional expertise, it's maddening. It's maddening.
Look, I'm not a teacher basher, but I mean, just a reality check here. The librarian in my elementary school was not a trained librarian. She was a fifth grade teacher who frankly struggled to do her job.
That's a failure of the institution to fund its school library.
Be that as it
That's
may.
a failure of the state.
Okay, fine, but the person who you were describing as the expert professional was basically just kind of thrown into the library. And again, at the risk of diverting us into other areas, in the literacy work that I do, there's this whole national movement right now about the science of reading, and it's predicated on the idea that, look, most elementary school teachers were simply taught how to teach reading incorrectly. They are the experts. The people who misled them were experts. So I appreciate the expertise of librarians, but a little skepticism of expertise is in order.
I just think that y'all are touching on something. I kind of lost the thread, but I think you were asking, like, when did this start?
Well, yeah, and I mean,
yeah. Maybe COVID. Maybe because people got more access to understand what their children were being taught. But I actually think the thread there is COVID was the catalyst to break up the trust between the parent and teacher relationship. And I would argue there are actors that swooped in to exploit that through COVID and then through other phenomena that have disrupted public education throughout the school systems in this country. And that then later led to an opening for this book ban phenomena to start happening, but we had it around critical race theory shortly after COVID, and then we had it around book bans. And for the first time, we're seeing PTAs argue with teachers' unions. I mean, it's one of the most trusted institutions in our society, our public school system. The relationship between the teacher and parent, has been ripped apart, starting with the pandemic. And I think this is just a continuation of that.
I would also say that I think it's a problem to conflate a skepticism of expertise with what's happening, because this isn't merely skepticism, which is always reasonably healthy. This is far more than that, because people are following through. They're not just asking questions, they're coming up with their own answers and deciding that they know better than people who generally are well-trained and do know what they're doing. Like an actual librarian, and not someone who is put into the position of being a librarian, has expertise and knows what their community needs. And that expertise should at least be engaged with, instead of someone deciding that this is a hostile situation and that they have to confront it instead of having a conversation. And we're not seeing any kinds of actual conversations. And that's how you know that most of this is not being done in good faith. Because if they really cared about community, they would have shown up to libraries far before this ever happened. These are not regular library users. These are not even regular community members oftentimes. These are, again, people who are part of a movement to try and stop progress at the very least.
I've been thinking a lot about how this moment looks different to a person who grew up, who was the age of the kids who would be affected by some of these challenges, bans, restrictions today. So I would say, I grew up during, I was an adolescent in the late 90s, early to mid 2000s, during the height of what we sort of called the culture wars, right? those wars back then were essentially about sort of institutional responses, whether they were the government or ancillary figures, ancillary government figures, or institutions like the church, responding to works of art that had been deemed by these individuals or institutions as controversial. But there was something in the work had essentially been made to get the reaction it got from the Catholic Church, from the government, with respect to any number of things. But I mean, the AIDS crisis was definitely a part of a lot of what was being debated, but also, these questions of free speech and what rappers were allowed to say and how they were allowed to express themselves. And I feel like a difference between what was happening then and what's happening now is that the reason I'm trying to think about what this inflection point is, because it seems meaningful, is that the other thing that happened during COVID was all the equal rights, George Floyd-oriented protests that happened. And I think there was something about the floodgate of sort of in-person education closing, that gate closing, and this sort of 400-year floodgate opening, and all of these people who had previously never gotten an education, the real education, right, about what was going on in this country, what this country is founded on, experiences that different people have been having, talking about having had, and being denied, for students being denied, any number of stories that were being told about, assorted histories of the United States of America. And that awakening happened both outside the classroom and eventually, this is anecdotal, but like people in my life, their children were then taking things they were experiencing with respect to the protests and the reaction to the protests into their classrooms. And a lot of those people, I remember during this period, there were a lot of questions about what books can I give my children to read? Where can I get information about all these things that I'm learning about this country that I never learned? And now my kids want to know, and I don't have answers. Where do I turn for that? And I feel like within a year, or less than a year, of there being some major cultural shift that, managed to be also a major political shift, a major reframing of the way we think about who we are as a people. It's meaningful that a lot of the people doing this reconsideration were white people who often lived in places where there were no non-white people, right? So there was a lot of awakening happening in small towns and big towns, and a lot of people didn't have answers. And I feel like one of the things that is behind what is happening right now, because it is happening, I was sort of disingenuous in my earlier question, it's happening from the top and the bottom, right? And people got scared because they either had been trying to repress this information or this history, this truth, or they didn't have answers for it, and they didn't know where to turn. And a library, an educator, a librarian is a great place to start. So I don't know, I'm just thinking like we're on the other side of that moment, and I'm wondering if part of what's behind this from where you guys sit is an attempt that's sort of bigger than like, my kid shouldn't read this because I don't think it's appropriate for them, but it's the fear of what happens when we learn anything.
Preach.
I'm actually just asking.
I mean, that resonates a lot with me. I think at the heart of this, it is very human to be uncomfortable and push back against anyone challenging your world paradigm. And I think that books do that. The racial justice protests did that. people are, and I could go on, but I think in a new information age where we are constantly bombarded with different stories and different perspectives, some of them are conspiracy theories, to be real. Some of them aren't. Sometimes some of them are by people that didn't have a voice before, and now they have a large following on Twitter or Instagram, or, you know, like, we're getting so many more different perspectives and stories, and for a lot of people, it is challenging the world as they know it, and that is very uncomfortable. That doesn't make them bad. It makes them human. And I think that's part of the story of what's happening here and what's fueling this. And it's fear. I'm scared if you tell me the world is not what I thought it's been for 45 years. That frightens me.
I appreciate the goodwill in that. When the topic of culture war in schools comes up, I always find myself kind of ruefully amused by it. And I say to people, do you know what we do in schools? I mean, literally, do you know what we do in schools? We make decisions on behalf of children about what is worth knowing, about what books are worth reading, about who our heroes and villains are, what attitudes and behaviors we praise and those which we condemn. The culture war isn't coming for schools. It's always been there. I mean, it's a cultural institution. We literally build schools to transmit our culture to our children. That's our job. So it surprises me when people are surprised by this. This is what the institution is for. And to the degree to which we are, at a moment when we are not going to agree on those things, and when there's tensions around them, well, those tensions and disagreements are going to manifest themselves in our schools. Frankly, it's appropriate. If not there, then where?
Wait, if it's not, it's appropriate for what?
It's appropriate for stakeholders, and we can say, well, you're not a parent here, but we are all stakeholders. We socialize the cost of education in this country.
Yes,
you
but
pay
not all
taxes
stakeholders
whether
are
or
created
not you
equal.
are have children in school or not. We have made a shared investment in, and look, I'm not here to carry the water of any activist organizations, but they're stakeholders too. We all have skin in this game.
Yes, but not all stakeholders are treated equally. And not all stakeholders are, like, so say one parent says, I don't want my child reading a book about racism, a white parent say. What if a black parent says, I do want my child reading about racism? In general, we know who's going to win that fight. So yes, stakeholders should have a say, but we don't live in a fair or equal world. And many stakeholders are silenced in service of stakeholders who have more power. And so that's actually why community public good institutions exist, to try and address these imbalances of power and to try to right historical wrongs by being neutral, by offering a range, as Emily said, of perspectives. It's not just about servicing your own interests, it's about servicing all interests. And to suggest that we should somehow try and change that is, I think, such a retrenchment, and it's such a failure of not only democracy, but just the idea of community and the kinds of materials that everyone should have access to.
Emily?
It has me thinking of a conversation I had with a librarian in New Mexico, Rio Rancho, I think is the town, and he experienced his first sort of challenge at his library. A patron came in and was sort of informed by one of these activist groups and had a list of books that she wanted removed from the collection, and he said, but you're a homeschool mom. You're here all the time. This is your library. Like, what is this about? And so he asked her, well, you don't want these books, which I think is like, I think I agree there's a lot of anxiety that comes up, and if you're looking for where to put that, a library is an actual physical place and you can go in and there's a real book and you can actually do something, right? And then, like, if you succeed in challenging a book and getting it out of the shelves, you've just experienced power. And that's like, I've experienced power before, and it's awesome. And so I understand that, like the drive to engender that in the people that you have doing your sort of marching for you. But he asked her, well, so those are the books you don't want in the library. Is there anything you do want in the library? And she said, oh, actually, these 5 books. And he said, okay, we'll buy 2 of them. And then the problem was sort of over, right? Because I think that people, like, you can't be against a library. You just can't. It's just not possible to be against a library or against a book. Like, who's against putting a book in the hand of a child to read them? Like, I have a child. If someone could get a book into his hands and make him read it, I'd be like, you're a genius, you're amazing, right? Like, you can't be against it. And so I think as a site where these big social anxieties are playing out, that's why it's even more important to preserve the institution in the face of that.
But I don't know, Emily. It feels like the book is the thing that's feared, right? I mean, I'm with you, but I also feel like the book is the symbol of the problem for a group of people who, whether they're doing it in earnest or it's disingenuously political or opportunistic, I think there is something about access to knowledge and education.
It matters. It's important, absolutely.
Yes.
And like, if I had been able to read a book when I was 15 about lesbian experience, I might have been a lesbian a little sooner, Like, if I'd been able to read a book about, like, the kind of person that I am in the world, that would be good. Like, books, it is true. The fear that you might read a book and have your mind blown or changed, or maybe you would think about yourself and other people a little differently. Maybe you would see in yourself something you didn't know was there and would maybe be someone else in the world, that, like, maybe the conditions of the possibility of your being could be expanded. Like, that does happen with books. That's why I'm a big, heavy reader. That's why I read every day, because I love that experience. And we want more of that, not less of that.
And that's called liberation. And it's called freedom. And it's freedom to explore who you are. And I think going back to the idea of bans, I think at the essence of this, we want people and children to have access, and we believe parents should have the right to decide what their children read, but not the right to decide what other children have access to.
And I would love a world where parents saw their children as people who also have a right to a private reading life, who have a right to intellectual freedom, who have a right to their own minds, right? Like my child, much to my deep regret, is sovereign unto himself, right? And he has a right to not read or read everything. And I wish we had a more expansive sense of children as people. I think that would be a big help in these conversations.
But I feel like this isn't about kids at all. I think that's kind of one of the things that I'm also struck by.
Yeah, but they suffer.
The implications,
they suffer
the
from it.
consequences are bad for kids, but it's not really about. I haven't heard any kids talk about anything during.
I rarely hear someone say both. We must ban these books because we must protect children, and also it is very important to have universal school food, right? Like, you never hear people both be for book banning and for SNAP benefits. Like, it never comes together. So that's why, when I hear people say this is about children's safety, I'm like,
Here are
I don't
35
think so.
other things you could.
You seem to be fine with them starving over the weekend.
Right.
Well, if you want to talk about things that we should be concerned with, I have patience for this conversation until I don't. And again, I'm going to play the teacher card. 2/3 of our kids are reading below basic in this country. And if you want to look at adults, I think last year, what you'll know this better than me, 1 out of 4 Americans didn't read any books whatsoever. So we are, in the case of children, we are arguing about books that children either cannot or will not read. Okay, so there's a little bit of forest and trees here. We have a reading crisis in this country, and it's not necessarily the one we're talking about tonight.
There's a great story in the Times, I don't know what paper it was in, because I just get on my phone now. But anyway, about, I think it was in Minnesota, a school district decided to invest in school librarians, and reading numbers went through the roof. You actually need a librarian there to put the book in the hand of a kid and to convince them to read it. I mean, that's part of the librarian as a portal to those books that we wish people were reading. So a response to low literacy rates to restrict access to books seems like an odd.
Yeah, I'm going to have to.
And also,
I have to respectfully disagree, just because this was the ethos under which I was trained as a teacher. That the key to raising good readers, the key to raising reading achievement, is put books in kids' hands that are about them, that reflect their interests, etc. There's just no evidence to suggest that works. We have a crisis in teaching kids how to actually read.
So
But
does
that's
not, yeah.
not really about book banning, and because yes, there is a reading crisis, but exactly as Emily said, the answer to that crisis has nothing to do with making kids have less access to books.
Read.
It's about making sure that we have well-funded school districts and teachers who maybe don't have 60 students in a classroom, so that children can actually have the pleasure and privilege of individualized teaching and instruction to learn how to read instead of being lost. And if you look statistically at who's not reading well, it's oftentimes people in impoverished school districts. And so the real conversation to be had about literacy is not with regards to book banning, but to how we fund education in this country, and how so often it is tied to property taxes, which means that the wealthy have children who read quite well and enjoy all kinds of privileges in schools, while the working class and poor have far less access to excellent education and teachers who are able to really help those children thrive. And are there some bad teachers in the mix? I'm sure. Nobody's perfect, but there are far more good teachers than not, and they are oftentimes working with really lousy levels of support. I mean, there's an entire website that exists to help teachers get money to buy books or toilet paper or other necessities for their classrooms. And so, yes, there are conversations to be had, and yes, we should be deeply concerned with literacy rates, but we have to understand the root causes and solve those problems. And if you really cared about children in this country, we would have things like universal pre-K.
I mean, to Roxane's point, I'm curious, Emily, where the majority of these bans are taking place. I mean, is there a socioeconomic disparity between where the challenges are happening and where, to Robert's, attempt to triangulate this question, is there any relationship between?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few different
these
ways that
things?
bans take place. Like, one is the angry parent shows up at the library board meeting with a list of 500 books and that sort of drama. And then there are state level restrictions on access to books in some states that we're seeing, like Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, where they have these vague, overbroad, don't give an inappropriate book to a kid, like something that's you can't, all it does is serve to chill the work of the school librarian or the public librarian. But they spring up all over. Like, I was in New Jersey a couple weeks ago, and someone was telling me that in her town, book bans were the only thing happening in the library, and it was constantly just a huge civic nightmare. But 20 minutes away, they hadn't seen any bans at all, and in the city, the village had put out a proclamation that we believe in the freedom to read. And so it feels like wildfires. I know that Moms for Liberty just had an event here in New York last week, and they have a pretty active chapter in Queens. So even in places where you imagine that politically people would not be in favor of organized attempts to censor reading materials, it pops up.
Roxane, I just want to ask a question about what the implications of this could be for people who write. And is there a world in which this is chilling, maybe not for a generation of writers who are, in your cohort, but children who get wind of this and think that there's something wrong with expressing yourself through writing? I mean, can you ruminate a little bit about what you think some of the implications of this could be that have really nothing to do with policy, but are these sort of terrible byproducts?
Yes. I'm not sure. I think creative people are always going to be creative. I do think that these things are cyclical. This is not the first time that we have seen a wave of censorship, and it will not be the last time. Will it make certain writers and thinkers censor themselves or pause before putting ideas into the world? Sure, but we're actually already there, because it's very challenging, depending on the subject position you inhabit, to put opinions into the world. Oftentimes it comes with death threats and doxing and harassment, whether you review a Beyonce album in a way that people don't approve of, or you say that perhaps women should have access to reproductive freedom. It's a range. But that's why censorship is a problem. That's why we have to resist it, because people then temper their ideas and they keep them to themselves, when these are things that should be part of discourse and should be allowed to be openly aired. And I would hope that there will not be a generation of writers who decides that they shouldn't write about being queer or being trans or being anything. And so time will tell, but I do think history has shown that in general, people write whatever they want to write, despite what is happening in public discourse and with banning, because that is the essence of creativity. And when you tell me not to do something, I really am like, I wasn't even thinking about that, but now I am, so let's go.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. I had been thinking in preparing to meet you all and talk about this, what my experience was. Now, I went to a school that had a library. It seemed like every book that had ever been written and published was in it. Nobody ever stopped me from taking one out. Ms. Kipling was my librarian, and she was wonderful. She read to us. And I don't ever remember, and I checked out some crazy books from the library, and nobody ever stopped me. But I'm wondering, for you guys, so the first book that I read that I felt like I probably shouldn't be reading, my mother used to get these books in the mail, like big, these companies would put out, these nice editions of books that had a big range of things. Talk about DEI. It went from like Cicero to Maya Angelou. And I would just read them and not know why they were just there. My mother had them, so they couldn't, how bad could they be? I read Lolita when I was maybe 10 years old.
Wow.
It was, it was there. Again, like Nabokov, great writer. He gets you that first page. I was like, low? Who's low? But the farther into the book I got, the more I knew that I probably shouldn't be reading it, but I kept going. And then I stopped. I would put the book back on the shelf so she wouldn't know I was reading it. And I'm curious, because I feel like the thing that another part of this, if we're thinking about this from the standpoint of children, the thing that they're being prevented from experiencing is a rite of passage, I think, as a literate person, as a reader. So much of who we are is formed either in opposition to cultural experiences we have, or entirely because we had the cultural experience. So I'm wondering, for each of you, what the first thing you read that you knew you should not have been reading, that if somebody knew you were reading it, they would have banned it because you shouldn't have. I'll start with you, Rahna.
Oh, thank you. I remember as a kid, maybe I was 7, 8, or 9, or somewhere around that age, I had this big bookshelf in my bedroom, all the books, and there was this one book, and I don't know how it got in there, and it was a book that explained sex to kids. I like to how are the birds and what are the birds and the bees all about? And I thought, how did this get in the bookshelf? I didn't buy this. Nobody gave this to me. And I'd open it up and I'd peek in it and be like, oh God, and I'd put it back, put it away. And then later as an adult, I realized my parents put it in there because they were too afraid to talk to me about it. They just wanted me to read about it. It was a great book. Highly recommend.
My mom in particular is a big reader, and she would take my brothers and I to the library every weekend, and I was allowed to take my little red wagon, and the library...
You had a little red wagon?
I did. I'm 49, so I've been around, and back in the day, we carted things around with wagons. It's a joke. But when I got to the library, they were always like, you can read anything you want, and you can take as many books as you want as long as you bring them back. And I took that as a challenge. And my parents are immigrants, and they just thought if it's in a book, it's fine. And so I read Clan of the Cave Bear at 8, and I learned a lot about what happens on an animal's pelt. And that's how babies are made. And then, of course, V.C. Andrews and Flowers in the Attic.
That is a real kid rite of passage, I gotta say.
It is. And it's like, I was like, I should not be reading these. And I was like 9 or 10. It was obscene.
Who were adults reading those books?
You turn out fine. The thing is, like, if you are parenting your child well, you are going to give them the tools to parse complex things, to parse even sex. And so I wish that people maybe trusted themselves and their children a little bit more. But anyway, Clan of the Cave Bear, check it out.
Robert?
I both love and I'm mortified by this question at the same time, because suffice it to say, I was not reading Nabokov at age 10. I was the son of a mechanic and a high school dropout, and we were not a literary family. So my you shouldn't be reading this moment, and I'm clearly older than everybody else on this stage. When I was a little kid, Jaws, the movie, was out, and I was in love with that movie, and I wanted to read the book. Loved the movie, loved the book. And this story is interesting to me because, this entire evening is predicated on the idea that we're going to put books in the hands of children that are going to spark an interest, it's going to create self-awareness, it's going to have some magical transformation on that child by dint of the fact they've got this special book in their hands. So I read Jaws. So 50 years later, I can tell you exactly what I remember about that book. I remember the sex scene. Yeah. And it was the sex scene that was not in the movie. If you remember the movie, it was a sex scene between the character played by Richard Dreyfuss and the wife of the character played by Roy Scheider. I remember that scene to this day in graphic detail. And I bring that up only as a note to say, kids do not always take the lessons from books that we assume they will.
Although in the book, it's kind of a big deal when they do it. Like, there's a reason it's not in the movie, is all I will say.
It left an impression.
Right.
You never forget your first time. That was my first sex scene.
I don't need to see a sex scene with Richard Dreyfuss. I'll just say that. No offense.
Emily.
So I could read anything I wanted. I had no conditions on the possibility of who I could become as a reader, and I think in a lot of ways that meant there were no conditions on the possibility of who I could become as a person, and I'm really grateful for that, and it's part of what we advocate for at the American Library Association. It's important. My mother had a book under her bathroom sink, so that's how I knew I wasn't supposed to read it, because it was absolutely hidden. Nancy Friday. Do you guys remember Nancy Friday?
No, say more.
So, yeah, definitely some erotica that I was not old enough? I was clearly old enough for it because I sought it out, and it was just rich descriptions of female pleasure.
So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like,
Not available in my school library, right?
Right. But I mean, it is an experience that you could, I'm describing a thing that essentially happened in a library. It just happened to be my mom's bedroom, right? Like, I think that there is something about just that wall of, that edifice of possibility that is exciting. And I think that, like, one of the things that we are thinking about here tonight is, like, what it means to even, like, omit one brick. Like, and why? Why? And what would it mean to not have it be one brick, but like an entire portion of the wall, right? So I just want to thank everybody for participating in this conversation. We've reached our time. Emily, Robert, Roxane, Rahna, thank you. Thank you guys for coming. That's it. We did it.